Good afternoon. Welcome to all of you, and thanks for joining us for Collegeville Connections and our session today with Eric LeCompte. For those of you who might not know, Collegeville Connections is a series of online events presented by the Collegeville Institute, located on the campus of St. John's University in Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. Collegeville Connections highlights the work of Collegeville Institute alums and friends from across the spectrum of Collegeville Institute programs, provides an opportunity for new guests, program alums, and friends to stay connected to each other and to the Collegeville Institute. And most importantly, you're going to learn a lot from our remarkable guests and from our guest today. I'm Don Ottenhoff, Executive Director of the Collegeville Institute. And before I introduce our guest, I'm going to turn to Carla Durand, a staff member at the Collegeville Institute. Carla is running the tech side of things for us today and will tell us what we need to know about logistics. So Carla.
Good afternoon and welcome. Just a couple words about the digital platforms that we're using today. We are using both Zoom and Facebook Live. So if you are viewing this presentation through Zoom, and when we get to the point of having some time for questions and answers, we'd ask that you please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. So if you're on Zoom, please use Q&A function. And then if you're viewing us on Facebook Live, you can please add your comments or questions to the comments function. And we do have another staff member who is watching that platform, and we'll be feeding those Facebook Live questions to us over here on Zoom. And if by chance you happen to lose your Wi-Fi connection on Zoom, you can just switch to the Facebook Live platform. And thanks for being here and enjoy.
Great, thank you, Carla. Eric LeCompte is a graduate of St. John's University, a recent Collegeville Institute resident scholar, and the executive director of Jubilee USA Network, a coalition of more than 750 religious groups and organizations, about which you're going to hear more in a moment. In his role as executive director, Eric has led religious groups to win policies that alleviate poverty, address global conflict, and promote human rights. He addresses the Holy See in Rome, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops here in the U.S., and the Presbyterian, Methodist, Lutheran, and United Church of Christ denominations, as well as Muslim and Jewish groups on the economy, climate issues, and global pandemic response. At the onset of the pandemic, Eric spoke to a special session of the United Nations about solutions for the health and economic crises caused by the pandemic. In 2019, he addressed the United Nations General Assembly on needed economic and climate policies to achieve the UN's own sustainable development goals. In 2016, his congressional testimony on Puerto Rico would become part of the basis for debt crisis legislation that Congress passed. Eric's views on religion, politics, and economic issues regularly appear in media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Associated Press, Bloomberg, McClatchy News Service, Barron's, National Public Radio, Marketplace, CNN Money, the Financial Times, The Hill, and more. We're delighted that Eric could take time from his very busy schedule to join us today for a conversation about his work with Jubilee USA. So welcome, Eric. And let's begin right there with Jubilee USA. You are Jubilee's executive director. And for those who may not be familiar with your organization, introduce us to Jubilee's mission.
Thanks, Don. It's a real gift to be with you and all of our friends today who've joined this webinar, and especially to be doing this event with the Collegeville Institute. Before saying a word about Jubilee USA, I think it's important, just to note how important the Collegeville Institute is and how St. John's has been in conversations that go back really over the past 100 years on the intersection of economic issues and our faith. And that's very much what we do at Jubilee USA. It's an intersection of economic rights and human rights, and how our faiths, how Scripture inspires us to promote an economy that's inclusive, to promote a world where all have enough, no matter who people are, no matter where they come from, that our belief is that all people are welcome at the table and all people should live in dignity. Jubilee USA began in the mid-1990s. It began out of a call of religious leaders, first and foremost Pope John Paul II. As the church was approaching and Christian churches were celebrating the 2000th year of the church, 2000 years since Christ came to us, Christian churches were celebrating Jubilee 2000, or the Jubilee year. In that moment, Pope John Paul II, as well as Jewish, Muslim, other Christian leaders, started to note that as we approach this celebration of the time, the birth of Christ, as we approach this great Jubilee anniversary, it's absolutely critical that we link it with the suffering that is taking place around the world. And at that time, in the mid-1990s, the majority of countries in the world were dealing with severe debt crises, where countries were paying more on their debt payments. Often these were illegitimate debts that dictators had taken out to build palaces instead of bridges. And the people were paying more on these debts than they were on healthcare, education, and all social services combined. So religious leaders were saying these economic policies like debt, tax, and trade actually mean death for the majority of the world's people, the majority of the world's population. So it was in that call of these religious institutions, that we began as Jubilee. And in the United States, ranging from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops to the Evangelical Lutheran Church, to the Methodist Church, to the Mennonite communities, as well as groups like American Jewish World Service and Islamic Relief, formed a coalition that they called Jubilee to specifically tackle these structures, structural policies like debt, tax, and trade, which are the foundational structures of poverty in our world, as well as inequality. During that time at Jubilee USA, we really began our focus on how do we deal with the global policies to alleviate poverty, to alleviate inequality. And what we found as we focused on debt relief, on tax issues, and trade issues into the mid-2000s, every time we would move world leaders to change their position on debt relief or stopping corruption, it literally would lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So the policies we work on are kind of where the rubber hits the road between the Bible and political and economic decisions that world leaders make.
This whole issue of debt relief is obviously very important. It's something you're very involved in. Sometimes when I read articles about it, there's a lot of graphs and charts and statistics and so forth. Can you tell us a story about an instance that you've been involved with that's caught your attention or your organization's attention that can kind of concretize what the debt problem is and what debt relief can lead to?
Well, I think when we look at those beginnings of Jubilee 25 years ago, we were seeing a reality that children across Africa were not getting access to education, not getting access to schools. We were able to meet many children who really had very few possibilities going forward because of the lack of education. So the actual global policies that we moved forward, the solutions, called by world leaders the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative in the early 2000s, out of that initial call from the religious leaders, and then another agreement called the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative in the mid 2000s. It actually had real impacts on people's lives and livelihoods because of those policies that we won in the mid 2000s. Which, might feel when you say the word debt, you kind of lose me in these structural economic issues. It had a huge impact. According to the United Nations, because of those policies we won, it means 54 million kids in sub-Saharan Africa went to school who never would have seen the inside of a classroom. It meant that school fees were canceled in Tanzania. It meant in Zimbabwe, or rather Zambia, that hundreds of thousands of people were actually able to see doctors for the first time. A more recent initiative that we move forward is a process to offer grants and continual debt cancellation that initially we won for Haiti in 2010 after their earthquake, but we actually strengthened for the Ebola affected countries in 2015, where all of their debts were canceled in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, meaning that now there's healthcare access for people who previously had none. And more recently, as we've been dealing with the pandemic, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about that later, that same process of debt cancellation and grants, we were able to move forward for the 29 poorest countries in the world so that people could access healthcare in the time of this crisis. So these big kind of economic policies, these economic structures of debt, tax, trade, transparency issues have very significant impacts. I think more broadly, just to kind of put that into context, if we're looking at how these policies deal with inequality and extreme poverty, we have to acknowledge right now that pre-pandemic numbers said that 80 people, less than 100 people, had more wealth than half the world's population, more wealth than 3.5 billion people who live on less than $1.90 a day. To put that extreme inequality into context, which is even worse now as we've entered the pandemic, but just to put that into context, that the people that live on less than $1.90 a day, under the age of 5, 22,000 children continue to die every single day because of these structural policies of debt, tax, and trade. That's an amazing number. More than 100,000 kids are dying every single week because of these structural policies. And these policies that we're working on to tackle inequality, to deal with poverty, ultimately, they're about saving lives and building livelihoods.
Well, let's stay on the issue. You said we talk about the pandemic later. Let's stay on it right now. You've raised the issue. Can you say more about how the pandemic has affected what you do at Jubilee USA from day to day?
Well, certainly, the tragedy of the pandemic has really put a lot of our work right in the center of the actual discussions that world leaders are having right now, from the White House to the G20 to the United Nations. And that's because of the reality that the policies we work on are policies that can prevent financial crisis. Over the last 25 years, we've won some very significant agreements from the United Nations, from the G20, about putting in these continual processes to address inequality, to alleviate poverty, to prevent crisis. What's unfortunate is that although we've reached agreements as recently as 2015, these policies have not been implemented. And I think the great sadness that I struggle with, that many who look at these issues struggle with, is had these processes been implemented before this pandemic began and was called a pandemic in March of 2020 by the World Health Organization, we would not be dealing with the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression. I think it's important to put that into context, both what that means for those of us who live in the United States, as well for those of us who live in every corner of the world. Over the last year, since the dawn of the pandemic, 95 million people have entered the ranks of extreme poverty, mostly women and children. Around the world, 495 million jobs have been lost, never to return, obliterated. Because of the pandemic, because of the vulnerabilities, because we didn't put the solutions in place, because of these structures of debt, tax, and trade, right now, 265 million more people are experiencing famine around the world. And if we just look at the United States, which the International Monetary Fund, this very powerful financial institution, says the United States will be one of two countries to experience stronger recoveries. The United States and China, according to their most recent reports, while the rest of the world will continue to be worse off post-pandemic. It's important to note that in the United States, we have 18 million kids who are experiencing hunger for the first time. When we look at the amount of jobs that have been lost in the United States, we've lost 22 million jobs that will never come back. We've lost 40% of small businesses in the United States because of the pandemic. So the reality is before the pandemic, much of the world was experiencing crisis. About half the countries in the world were experiencing debt crisis or financial crisis, not able to pay their bills, let alone meet the health and education needs of their people. And what we found is post-pandemic, those vulnerabilities have been increased. Poverty has increased, inequality in the wealthiest countries has increased. And now we're looking at the reality where many countries are now dealing with a higher level of crisis than they've ever experienced before. So the pandemic has shined a light on the work that we've done at Jubilee for the last 25 years on debt policies, tax policies, these transparency policies. And they're also the primary solutions that we've worked on at Jubilee that world leaders are looking at in terms of dealing with the economic impacts of the crisis and trying to get vaccines distributed and trying, if at all possible, to somehow emerge as a global community with more resilience post-pandemic, instead of what the reports say right now, that much of the world will be worse off after this pandemic.
That's very helpful, because when you read the newspapers, you see the charts about infection rates. Which state has the highest infection rate? Are they up? Are they down? What you're talking about are impacts that go far beyond infection rates. Not that those aren't important; they're very important. But that's very helpful to kind of point out, and it's great to hear that someone's keeping their eye on those kinds of things as well. But I want to move on a little bit. So when I hear the word Jubilee, so I read the Bible, it has a biblical ring to me. So I'm kind of curious, do biblical or Christian theological perspectives guide Jubilee's work? And if they do, how do these ancient texts inform modern day crises, the kind of thing that you're talking about right now?
The theme of Jubilee, or what we refer to as the Jubilee Promise, is as you note, Don, one of the central themes in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. This idea that when we open up the Bible and we start with Genesis, that we're reading about a rich and abundant world that God has created for us in 7 days. And that we're actually closest with the Creator when we're sharing that abundance among us, when we're sharing those resources among us. In many ways, the Torah, in the Hebrew scriptures, as we open the Bible, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, actually looks to try and legislate this reality of living in closeness with God. Using that number of seven, the 7 days in which God created the world, very, very important for these ancient law books. It's certainly debated how many people literally lived by these law books, but some scholars argue that Hebrew communities as large as 100,000 people lived under what are called the Jubilee Laws. When we crack open these scrolls, these books, we read that every 7 years, debts are forgiven. Every 7 years, slaves are set free. Every 7 years, the land is allowed to rest, to go fallow, so God can provide directly to us. And every 7 times 7 years is the Great Jubilee, the great time of restoration, when we're all protected from having too much or too little. It's actually a continual process that's promoted in the Hebrew scriptures. And when we look at the time of the prophets, when they're reminding people to go back and live in right relationship with God, they refer very specifically to these laws. These particular laws, Isaiah, Micah, Amos, remind the people to go back and be with God and live under the Jubilee law. And then dramatically, at the onset of the Christian scriptures, we read in the Gospel of Luke in Jesus's first public act, where he actually reads from Jubilee scripture. He reads from Isaiah that's reminding the people about every 7 years setting slaves free, every 7 years living in communion with God, every 7 years forgiving debt and preparing for the Great Jubilee, the great year of the Lord's favor, 7 times 7 years, 49 years, 50 years, the great restoration. Jesus reads that scripture in the synagogue, his first public act, and when he closes it, he says, "This scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." And we know from the scripture that the people are baffled. They're saying, "Isn't this the day laborer's son from Nazareth? And he is telling us today that the age of inequality is over." So for Christians, for people of faith, we see that inspiration that comes from our teachings, from our history, from the Bible are incredibly important because they lay out a continual process for ensuring that inequality is addressed and we're all protected from having too much or too little. We believe that actually leads our work today at Jubilee, and it inspires our work to work on what may sometimes feel like wonky processes, like a global bankruptcy process, which Pope Francis has endorsed, but and processes that can deal with tax evasion and corruption, so that countries actually have enough money before a crisis to get through it. Had a continual process been in place, like a debt or bankruptcy process, we actually would have had the tools already to prevent most countries from going into deeper crisis during the pandemic. So we see those teachings, that scripture, as a real inspiration for the work we do. And going back to the beginning of our conversation, it's certainly clear why Pope John Paul II directly connected the theme of Jubilee to the church's anniversary, as well as the challenge to all of us to fulfill the promise of Jubilee.
The idea of a Jubilee year, whether it's every 7 years or 70 years, sounds kind of utopian. Is there a distinction in that you make, or a distinction in your mind between debt relief and debt cancellation?
Well, a debt cancellation is one of the different types of debt relief when we're talking technically. And so, when we talk a little bit about some of the decisions that world leaders are making, there are many different types of debt relief. Some of those are suspension of debt payments. Some are actual debt cancellation and debt reduction. When we're talking about, I think scripture and where we take a lot of our inspiration from, we actually do have processes in existence that mirror continual processes to deal with the structural issues of debt, tax, trade, corruption. So, for example, in just about every country in the world, we depend on a bankruptcy process for domestic global stability. Corporations depend on it, cities depend on it, institutions depend on it. Amazingly, that process is absent from the global financial system. That continual process that can ensure stability. And it's part of the why we're experiencing such a significant crisis on a global scale. Similarly, when we look at what the scripture inspires us to, some of it is fairly basic stuff. Again, we depend on, for stability in the US economy, as well as in most countries around the world, around basic rules on responsible lending and borrowing for our mortgages, for our credit cards. The bank isn't going to give you a loan to buy a house unless they can prove that you're actually buying a house with it. They aren't going to give you a loan unless they know that you have some ability to pay that loan back. These kinds of basic issues of transparency and responsibility actually are absent in much of the global financial system. And that's part of why we're experiencing this crisis. Beyond these inspired policies we see from the Bible, we actually see there's actual precedent for these kinds of policies in our Judeo-Christian laws in many countries of the United States. But for a number of reasons, they're not functioning in the financial system. So part of what Jubilee does, beyond being inspired by the scriptures, is looking at these common sense, practical global policies that need to be a part of the structure of the financial system to continually address inequality and to alleviate poverty.
So I kind of got us off track, but I did ask you earlier about the relationship between Jubilee, the name Jubilee, and what you do, and its roots with a Christian, Judeo-Christian scripture. But in my introduction, I also mentioned that you work interreligiously. That is the case, isn't it?
It is. In fact, right now, on many of the policies that we're promoting at the G20, the White House, our recent meeting with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, we've brought signatures from 260 religious institutions and groups, which include synagogues, churches, and mosques. So beyond the Jewish and Christian community, an important part of Jubilee is also working with other faiths in terms of the Muslim community and the Hindu community. Where we don't share scripture in the same way with the Muslim community, we actually do share some rather profound teachings on continual processes to address inequality and poverty, and specifically structural issues such as debt and tax. In fact, when we look at some of the Jubilee issues, the Jubilee Promise from a Muslim perspective, some of the teaching from the Muslim side is actually more specific and technical than what we find in much of our Christian and Jewish tradition, where it actually looks at great problems in terms of loaning people money at interest, as opposed to giving grants and allowing people, according to the Quran, to be able to give back when their time of need is over. So there are, in some ways, some more profound ways that the Muslim tradition looks at some of these issues. And I'll tell you, I think one of the great powers of Jubilee is that not only are we able to transcend political divides. Congressional Quarterly cites our work as the last standing bipartisan coalition in the United States, in Washington, D.C., but we're also able to transcend and bridge different religious institutions. About 6 years ago in 2014, the first time that we had a meeting with Pope Francis, we met with the Secretary of State of the Holy See, Cardinal Parolin, who's a big supporter of our Jubilee efforts. And at that point, they were really exploring how to work with the Jubilee Promise and move that forward as a part of Pope Francis's papacy. But the most important piece that Cardinal Parolin shared with us is he said, beyond the structural issues that Jubilee works on, which many people are not paying attention to, the great power of Jubilee is that it includes Muslims, Jews, and Christians. It is that power which makes Jubilee transformational. And I think he was right.
I'm curious just how does the relationship between Islamic understandings of how money works in a community, how well are you able to kind of integrate or play off or understand one another on these issues relative to, let's just say, Christianity?
Well, I think that what we find in common is that our faiths share certain principles on being in right relationship with the Creator, treating one another justly, and not taking advantage of one another. So I think in a very basic sense, we find that our faiths all call us to be in community, call us to be at the table, and to take care of anyone who's in need. Now, certainly, there are distinctions within our traditions and ways that our histories have looked at those particular issues, but we find a lot of commonality. I would say the other thing that's incredibly important for our efforts at Jubilee is that we are big proponents of interfaith reflection and interfaith prayer, which means being able to value the very different types of prayer and traditions that people bring to the table, but also finding very clear ways beyond appreciating each other's traditions to be able to pray together, reflect together, and allow that to continue to lead to our analysis that we need to share together to transform the structures of the global economic system.
Well, that's interesting. So there are these biblical roots to what you do in Jewish and Christian scriptures, and you've talked about your interfaith work. But the organizations you're working with, G20, International Monetary Fund, the White House, on and on and on, these are not religious organizations. So what is their response to your work, your interventions, your attempts to make some big changes?
Well, in many ways, I think the reception we receive is very positive. I can certainly tell you in my work with Jubilee over the last 12 years, whether there is a Republican sitting in the White House or a Democrat sitting in the White House, we've had an open door and we've been able to move forward our policies no matter who is sitting in the White House and no matter who is in leadership in Congress. And in big part, we believe that's because of the religious institutions that make up Jubilee. Now, I should note that Jubilee USA also includes some of the largest unions and environmental organizations in the United States, political and advocacy groups. But at the forefront, our founders are religious institutions. So just to give you an example, we held a historic hour-long meeting with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen in March. And we brought to that meeting the leaders, the highest ranking leaders of US religious institutions. So we had with us the heads of the Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, the Methodist Church, the senior leaders of the Union of Reformed Judaism, all of the major Christian churches, the head of the United Church of Christ. And we essentially went over these Jubilee policies, But like any meeting that we have at the White House, that we have with the leader in Congress, that we had with Secretary Yellen, we're sure to open that meeting and to close that meeting with prayer. So the leader of the Union of Reformed Judaism offered our opening prayer and then made a comment on the stimulus package and how that could help and would help people in the United States as well as people around the world. And our closing prayer was offered by Reverend Bishop Elizabeth Eden, the presiding bishop of the Lutheran Church. Again, wanting to open and close us in prayer and allow for that time between the seven of us and Secretary Yellen to be a conversation that was also informed and inspired by prayer. And then, we dug down deep into the technical policies. It was one of the primary leaders of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops who talked about one of the most important issues that we've won recently with the G20 and IMF since that meeting with Secretary Yellen in mid-March about these emergency reserve funds called special drawing rights. The International Monetary Fund, this financial institution that we see as the second most powerful institution after the White House, yet many of us have never heard of it, even though it affects our lives and our jobs almost as much as the very oxygen we breathe, can create this money in a type of crisis, this currency called special drawing rights. So working very specifically with all these religious groups, but the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, they presented to Yellen why we needed to activate this money for all countries of the world. Since the meeting, it was activated. We had the head of the Lutheran Church talk about climate issues and the reality that some of the most important climate decisions that are going to be made in the next 5 years will not be made at the United Nations. They're going to be made as a part of crisis response by financial institutions like the IMF, like the G20. The other major religious leaders also presented our policies from tax and trade, from access to vaccines, as we had this hour-long conversation with Secretary Yellen. So I think it's interesting. What we found is that religious institutions and faith give us more power. In the United States, religious institutions are incredibly respected for the social services and charitable work they've done. And that's similar around the world when we coordinate religious institutions in Africa or in the Caribbean, who are the primary social service providers for their countries, that they in very special ways can weigh in with world leaders on these structural policies of debt, tax, trade, and how they impact people living in poverty.
It's pretty amazing that you had this meeting with Secretary Yellen. Can you open the door for us a little bit? Did Secretary Yellen ask questions? Did she seem to be informed about who you are and who the groups that she was meeting with are and what their interests are?
Well, very much so. And certainly I've had a relationship with Janet Yellen for over 10 years in her previous positions. And I've met with every Treasury Secretary and President on our issues over the last decade. Again, while we are a religious institution, it's interesting in terms of these global structural issues, which are the continual agenda of the G7 and G20, there are not a lot of groups that actually focus on it. Yeah. So going back in our history on 25 years, it's really the Jubilee movement that has become known to world leaders for dealing with these structural issues. The term that's used broadly around the world is this idea of civil society, but civil society organizations, nonprofit groups that work on charitable policies. But there's a very small sliver of groups that are actually working on the structural issues that are being debated by the United Nations and the G20. So from a point of expertise, we're very well known by world leaders. But I think what really gives Jubilee USA and our network a lot of power is that religious institutions inform, inspire, and influence. And that was very clear with our meeting with Secretary Yellen. So previous to the Biden administration coming in, the only groups and leaders that Secretary Yellen made time to meet with were the leaders of Fortune 500 companies, G20 finance ministers and presidents, and governors. We were the first group so soon into the new administration where she met with and had this historic meeting with the high-ranking religious leaders and institutions. Similarly, under the Trump administration, we met with high-level people there, including Treasury Secretary Mnuchin. But this meeting was unique because it was more than me. It was really religious institutions speaking on behalf of people struggling in the United States, but also around the world, on the actual 6 issues, which are the primary issues that Secretary Yellen is working on right now in terms of global poverty and inequality.
Interesting. You did mention already climate issues, environmental issues, that they're part of what you see as a biblical understanding of Jubilee Promise or Jubilee economics. Say more about that, the place of climate and the environment in Jubilee's work, and especially in your efforts to influence the decision of these world leaders.
Well, in terms of these particular issues on climate, we also see this as a very important part of the inspiration, the holistic message, which comes from Scripture. When we return back to that 7 times 7, when debts are forgiven and slaves are set free, a very important part of that biblical message, that holistic message of what it means to be in right relationship with God, with others, with our planet, is that we are to let the land rest, let the land go fallow, so the land can regenerate and provide directly to us. That particular part of the scripture is very important when we look at climate change. And for us at Jubilee, it's why climate issues are a part of every single policy we work on. It's a part of our reform of global financial institutions like the IMF. It's a part of our work in terms of debt relief and debt cancellation. It's a part of how we look at tax and transparency issues. It's an important part of how we look at trade issues and creating a global bankruptcy process. So we see that as almost a sinew that connects all of the issues. And again, an important part from Scripture. Right now, when we're looking at this great time of pandemic that we're living in, this great crisis, one of the biggest concerns that Jubilee brought to world leaders a year ago was that climate issues would not be forgotten as we deal with the economic issues, as we deal with the health issues. And the reason that's important is often when countries experience crisis, the first thing that happens in a restructuring or trying to bring the country back to some financial health is they sell off their financial resources. So, for example, Don, you and I have talked before about what happened last year as Ecuador was struggling with its debt crisis, which was early in the pandemic. And China did something that it's done before. Essentially, it snapped up over a third of Ecuador's rainforest to feed its extractive needs, oil and gas exploration, in part of our lungs from planet Earth. That's something that happens, and it's actually a very important piece that Jubilee decided a year ago that we were going to make sure was not forgotten by world leaders. So actually, one of our team members wrote an authoritative paper, a 50-page paper, to go into all of the issues that we need to look at in terms of how we could either win our goals around climate change or lose them around what happens in the financial crisis. One of the things that I was able to spend time doing last fall when I was a resident scholar at the Collegeville Institute was work on a climate power map. And this power map was very important. Since then, we've presented it to over 40 environmental organizations, economic groups, because when people have talked about climate change, and I'm sure many of the people who are part of this webinar today realize that when we say climate change, well, we think that's the Paris Accord or these United Nations agreements. And that's how we're going to be able to save our planet. That's how we're going to be able to protect our environment. And although that's kind of the popular message, unfortunately, it's wrong. What we found with our analysis and information that the most consequential decisions regarding the climate, regarding protecting natural environments, are going to be made over the next 5 years by the IMF, the G20, the G7, the US Treasury, as a part of financial responses to the global pandemic. When we were talking about that meeting with Secretary Yellen, she sent out a press release after the meeting, and she noted at that point it was the strongest remark she had made to us as religious leaders that the most important thing that must happen, the most important thing that needs to move forward, is that all of our decisions need to be along what happens with the climate. One of the most important executive orders that President Biden has made so far has not been to rejoin the Paris Accord, but to say that every decision that Treasury makes must address how climate change is impacting our planet. And I think that's very significant. And that follows a lot of the work of Jubilee, that if we really want to address climate change over the next 5 years, we need to really track very quickly the decisions that financial institutions are making. And as they make decisions in response to the pandemic on trade, on debt, and tax, simultaneously, every decision will create and have components of climate change issues. So it's a very important piece of the Jubilee ethos traditionally, but now more than ever, being smart on climate change and knowing where the decisions are being made is critically important.
Yeah, the interrelationship among all of these different players and interests is truly amazing. And I've lost sleep, Eric, since I found out that Ecuador's debt crisis led to, could lead to the destruction of a third of Ecuador's rainforest and its consequences for all of us as a result of that.
And unfortunately, that's the story of every country in the Amazon region. It's why these policies and this work is so important.
And unfortunately, China is not the most responsive country when it comes to the organizations that you've been talking about that you're in conversation with.
That's right. And even right now, we've certainly had a lot of success over the last year, both in terms of debt policies and tax policies, and then some of the work we're pushing on trade in terms of vaccine distribution. But on many of those policies, China, if they support it, come along kicking and screaming. And that's a real problem. Just looking at some of the debt relief policies we've won, we began the conversation talking about some of those major global policies we won in the 2000s. Over the last year, we've won the most significant debt reduction policy called the G20 Common Framework. Since that time, it has the ability to permanently reduce the debts of countries so that they can be able to ensure that appropriate monies are going to education and healthcare. And China has been resistant in much of that process. So right now, China and the private sector and how they're participating in debt relief and being able to support a global economy that emerges with some resilience, they have been a challenge. I think on the positive side, they have come along in many issues. But there's also been some real ways that they're still holding back and resisting.
Yeah. So I do want to ask you again in the introduction. I mentioned that Pope Francis is behind what you're doing there in Jubilee USA. What's the backstory on that? How did that happen?
Well, I think it's important to note, with our work with all religious institutions since the mid 1990s, there's been continual growth. So certainly Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict were big supporters of a lot of the Jubilee processes we move forward. Pope Francis, in some ways, though, has been the most specific technical on a lot of the policies we work on. I have been fortunate enough to be advising the Holy See over the last 10 years, and many of the nuncios that advocate on behalf of the economic positions of the Holy See. So there's been that relationship there. And then after meeting with Cardinal Parolin and a lot of the work that we've done with Cardinal Turkson's dicastery of integral human development, in 2015, when Pope Francis visited the United States, he addressed the United Nations, where he endorsed a global bankruptcy process to deal with the different global policies, the policies of debt and economic issues that are the primary causes of inequality, poverty, human rights abuse, and global conflict. It's how he began his speech, and I like to tell people it's the most important speech that Pope Francis ever gave. Unfortunately, no one understood it. The journalists that covered it covered what he said about human trafficking. They covered what he said about the environment and climate, but they didn't understand, like he does so well in Laudate Si and Fratelli Tutti, his recent encyclicals. He frames all of these issues in the structural policies of economics. And part of that is also Pope Francis. When he led the church in Argentina, his country was held hostage in a debt crisis by predatory hedge funds, these group called vulture funds that were trying to collect on the debt while extreme poverty increased in that country. So he looked down at the other side of a barrel of a gun from these predatory hedge funds. And it's part of why I believe he speaks so technically on these issues. 3 weeks before we called this a global pandemic, the first week of February in 2020, I went to Rome to sit down with Pope Francis and 12 finance ministers, the head of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, the head of major UN institutions, to actually have a conversation about what are the Jubilee policies we need in place to prevent the next crisis from happening. At that meeting, Pope Francis again talked about bankruptcy. We talked about tax and transparency issues. After leaving Rome, 3 weeks later, the World Health Organization would say, we are in a pandemic. Weeks later, the IMF would say, we are facing the worst economic shock and crisis since the Great Depression. And that wonderful backstory of being with Pope Francis, who works so closely with us on these issues, the sadness of that story is, had these policies been in place when we reached previous agreements, had the policies that we sat down to talk about with Pope Francis in the first week of February 2020 been in place, the United States and every country in the world would not be experiencing the economic crisis that we currently are experiencing.
Well, our time is getting short, and I do want to ask you kind of a big question, but I'm sure it's one that you hear a lot. So these huge financial issues you've been talking about, taxes, debt, trade, transparency, they can feel overwhelming, and the problems they create just way beyond their ability to solve them. Yet during this conversation, you've clearly said that tackling these issues is critical to solving many of the ills that face the world: poverty, inequality, climate change, even the pandemic. But I don't think anyone listening here during this webinar is the head of a multinational corporation or a political leader. How can someone like me act on these issues? Those of us who are in pulpits or pews, what can we do about these vast issues that you're talking about?
Well, I think that's a critical question. And certainly there is much we can do. And what I've found over my work in the last 25 years is that the power of faith communities and people of faith is a force. And when we work together in community, we have the ability to change global policies, local policies, and we've seen it time and time again. And I do believe that people who sit in the pews and those that preach from the pulpits have an enormous amount of power on these particular issues, and we've seen it. So one of the things I would say very clearly is it's important to join actions that are taking place, to take our faith, to take our Bible, to move that forward, to join others taking action. All of the progress we've made this year and all the progress we hope to make over the next 5 years is only because religious institutions in the United States, congregations, synagogues, and mosques have signed statements to join every single part of our work and influence Republicans and Democrats to change global debt, tax, and trade policies, to move forward stimulus policies to support American workers. So one thing, I would ask anyone that is a part of a religious community that worships at a church, a synagogue, a mosque, or other religious institution to go to our website and have your institution be one of the signers on our statement that we're giving to the G7 and G20 every several months before they make their next decision on issues of climate change, on loans for poor countries, on debt relief, on tax and transparency, and anti-corruption issues. Right now, over 260 religious institutions and partners, from big institutions like the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America to your local church, synagogue, or mosque, have signed on to this statement. So I'd encourage you to do that. Also, the petition drives we're doing are very, very important, and they do make a difference for Congress and for the White House. You can download those petitions on our website as well, jubileeusa.org. I think those are incredibly important things moving forward. And I also believe, as people of faith, those of us who preach from the pulpit, who share sermons, who write in church bulletins, it's important to share the Jubilee ethos and the Jubilee Promise. It's important to talk about what some of these themes in Scripture should motivate us towards and inspire us to in terms of living in right relationship with God and the Creator. So I think those are just a few things where people can start in terms of educating themselves, taking action, and motivating their religious institutions to do more.
So to summarize in my kind of pithy way, you're saying don't be disheartened, one thing, and don't underestimate yourself. Don't underestimate your power as religious people and as religious organizations.
I agree. I think that's right on.
Good, good. Well, we have one question that's come up. I'm going to ask you that gets kind of to the issue of Jubilee. Knowing that the concept of Jubilee is rooted in the Judeo-Christian scriptures, how do leaders from Buddhist, Hindu, Islamic, other religious traditions understand Jubilee, specifically as it relates to your work?
Well, certainly, and I know we've had a chance to talk a little bit about the Islamic community, and certainly when you go on our website and you see the different religious institutions and groups that are signing our letters to the White House, to the G20, to the International Monetary Fund, you're also going to see that there are Buddhist organizations signed on, Muslim groups, as well as Hindu groups. Certainly, it wouldn't be accurate to say that a Buddhist community or a Hindu community shares the same types of scriptural tradition we have, or the same kind of teaching that we have that's inspired by our faith. But what we do have in common among all these religious institutions is that there are common teachings on teaching, on treating everyone equitably, on ensuring that everyone can have enough. And certainly, all traditions raise concerns around inequality and poverty. So it's why that these groups, these institutions are able to work with us at Jubilee and able to focus on these issues. It's because of particular principles and teachings that we share in common. Although, again, there's a very particular distinction from scriptural tradition.
Sure, sure. Well, we are at the end of our time for today. So thank you very much, Eric, for this wonderful and informative conversation. You've certainly enlightened us about a lot of things. And thanks to all of you online for joining us today. We invite you to join us for future Collegeville Connection events. Please watch for event information and registration details on our website, social media platforms. Next Wednesday, May 5, same time, noon to 1 Central Time, you'll have the opportunity to hear from agent, editor, and writer Javon Bolden, who will be joined by author Ellie Rosher in a discussion designed especially for Christian and religious writers about the business, the ins and outs of publishing. Lots of practical advice in that conversation. So again, thank you for joining us. Please check out Jubilee USA, their website, learn more about them, and please join us again. Thank you.